Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of The Written Page, the podcast that you will be able to listen to on my YouTube channel, Anton GF, very soon. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez. I'm talking to everybody out there from the great state of Tennessee, the town of Jackson, Tennessee. And today we have a very special show, episode number 3, because we're going to be talking to somebody that I've wanted to talk to for a very, very long time, since I first bought one of his editions, in particular of the ghost stories, the complete ghost stories of M.R. James. I'm talking about S.T. Joshi, who was born originally in India but spent most of his life in the United States. He's one of the foremost scholars on the work of H.P. Lovecraft, another writer that I greatly admire. Very, very prolific author. He has written biographies and studies of Lovecraft's work, annotated editions of his work, and that of other writers such as M.R. James, Algernon Blackwood, or Ambrose Bierce, among many, many others. He's also written fiction of his own, many, many scholarly articles, and he has edited a wide variety of journals. Mr. Joshi, welcome to The Written Page, and thank you for answering our call.
Sure, glad to be here.
We're very happy to have you. You're joining us from the beautiful city of Seattle, Washington, but you were born originally in Pune in India. Do you remember anything about the few years that you lived there?
Incredibly enough, I don't. I lived there for the first 5 years of my life, but here's the strange thing. I did not actually speak, did not utter a word until apparently I was 4 years old. And the reason for that, I have been told, is a couple of reasons. First, there were several different languages spoken in my family, including English, but certainly several also of the Indian languages, whether it be Marathi, which is my native language, that's the language spoken around the Bombay area, but others as well. That was one thing. The other thing, apparently, is I was very spoiled as a child, and so all I had to do was point to something, and I would get it. So I apparently felt no need for speech. And what people say is that speech and memory are very closely tied together, so because I didn't speak, I don't remember much, which is a shame.
I think I did speak, but I really don't remember very much of the very first 5 years of my life, and I believe you were 5 when your family moved to the United States.
That's correct. We went from India to the Midwest. My mother particularly was keen on pursuing her career as a professor of mathematics, and she felt she wasn't really getting ahead in India for various reasons, and so she established herself at the University of Illinois in Urbana, and I came over with her along with my 2 older sisters, and my father came a little later because he had work to finish up in India. He was a professor of economics. But, in the course of time, we all settled in the Midwest, first in Illinois and then Indiana.
What memories do you have of your early childhood in the United States when you began to speak and you didn't need to point at everything? What memories do you have?
I have lots of memories of those early years. I'll tell you, they still remain very vivid in my memory. I can't even go into all of them, but I do remember an incident when I was, we came here in the summer of 1963. I was barely 5 years old. That fall, I was basically enrolled in a kindergarten course in Illinois. I did not know English at the time, or not very well at any rate. And I remember distinctly sitting on the floor, the carpeted floor of this room with all these other children and the teacher, and they were speaking a language I did not know. Now, it wasn't alarming, really speaking, or frightening. It just was a little curious, because clearly I did not understand English. But, the way things happen then is at an early age and you're immersed in a different culture, you pick up English very quickly. But here's the curious thing. English is a difficult language to learn, not because it has too many rules, because it has too few. Almost anything goes in English, and it's frustrating for non-native speakers to pick up some of the nuances and even the grammar. And I remember, even at the age of 7 or 8, looking through grammar books of the English language and trying to figure out why certain things happen the way they do in the English language. And maybe that led to a sort of more scholarly approach to English in later years. I don't know.
Do any of these memories that you have of these early years in the United States relate to literature in any way?
Yes and no. In the first place, in the first 5 years of my life here in this country, I was actually just interested in becoming a normal American boy. I played lots of sports and things, had a lot of friends, and didn't really face any prejudice. I mean, we were living in university towns; they were fairly tolerant, and lots of foreign people there, including a lot of Indians. And I did not necessarily associate with Indians. Most of my friends were, Americans, and they accepted me readily. But I actually wasn't very interested in writing or reading. I did well in school. I mean, because I felt school was fairly easy and wasn't really particularly challenging, and I did well. But around the age of 10, my older sister said, "Oh, you need to start reading books. This is not good for you, just to go play football all the time or whatever." And so she dragged me to the public library and said, "Just check out something, anything you want." And the curious thing is, I somehow naturally gravitated either to fantasy or indeed to pure horror. And I remember reading anthologies of horror stories, for young adults, edited by, say, Rod Serling or Alfred Hitchcock. I read Poe pretty early. I remember a fabulous illustrated edition of Poe. I think it was illustrated by one of the great illustrators from the past. I can't remember which one it was. Anyway, and that was fascinating, both for the text and for the illustrations. And then finally, around the age of 13, I believe, I stumbled upon Lovecraft in my public library.
Now, I wonder if that illustrator you're talking about is Gustave Doré, maybe.
I think it's Harry Clark.
Harry Clark, okay.
I've seen Doré, but that was later. I'm now beginning to think it was the Harry Clark illustrations, which are tremendous.
I just said that because I remember that Poe was also one of the first writers that I ever read in Spanish translation. The Spanish translation of the great Cortázar, who translated into Spanish from the French the work of Edgar Allan Poe. And I remember having an edition that had illustrations by Doré. But at 13 is when you discovered the work of H.P. Lovecraft. How did this, in some ways, change your life? What attracted you about the literature of H.P. Lovecraft back then?
Well, I think by that time I was already, I had been trained on Poe and that dense, almost over-the-top language. I loved Poe's language. His prose was tremendous. And I didn't really find much interest in sort of the minimalist prose of somebody like Hemingway. It just didn't seem to resonate with me so well. So when I came upon somebody like Lovecraft, who also used this very richly textured prose, I said, wow, this is fabulous. And of course his conceptions were so extraordinary. I mean, I had read nothing even remotely like it in any of the previous work I had read. I mean, I had started also reading science fiction, but I never really was that much interested in science fiction. Again, it struck me as sort of, I don't know, how can I put this, rather cold and sort of, I couldn't relate to it somehow. I wanted something set in the present day, or at least a recognizable, objective realm with the weird stuff coming in from the outside, and Lovecraft just fed that interest, tremendously.
And upon reading Lovecraft, or because you were reading Lovecraft, upon encountering his work, you began to write fiction of your own as well.
Yes, I think I had actually started a little before that. I'd also been tremendously interested in detective stories, mystery stories. I read, I think, the complete works of Agatha Christie probably at that time, and many other writers as well. So actually one of my first works was an entire detective novel. It was very bad, but I actually managed to finish it at about 175 pages. And I came up with my own smart aleck detective, in the standard manner. But gradually I shifted to horror. I started also writing horror stories. Initially, I think the inspiration was other writers like Ambrose Bierce, perhaps. I was very much taken with Bierce and his cynical view of humanity. I enjoyed that. But gradually I did start also writing imitations of Lovecraft, whether it be explicitly imitating his Cthulhu mythos, or in some cases, as other writers have testified, an almost unconscious imitation of some of the themes and motifs in Lovecraft stories. I wasn't even aware of it at the time, but later on I said, "Oh, good Lord, that this story is clearly taken right from one of Lovecraft's stories."
Well, I see myself reflected in that as well, because you mentioned Agatha Christie and you mentioned Poe and Lovecraft, and those were writers I was reading as well around that time when I was about 12 to 13, together with all those Sherlock Holmes stories by Conan Doyle, and also trying to write some stories of my own, which were absolutely terrible, and I'm glad they did not survive. But when you're talking about that age, when you were 13 and you encountered Lovecraft, we're talking possibly about the early 1970s or so.
Yes.
That was a very exciting moment culturally in this country. Were you drawn to other types of art or just literature?
Well, I was a musician, a classical musician, for many, many years. In fact, my mother enrolled me in a beginning violin class when I was about 8 or 9. I can't quite remember, something like that. And I exhibited some talent and kept on with the violin throughout high school. So I played the violin for many years. I also actually started trying to compose classical music, again, imitating some of the composers that I had enjoyed at the time, like Vivaldi or Bach or Handel, whoever. But of course, that age was the great age, I think, of rock and roll music as well, pop music. And I became a devotee of the Beatles very early on, when I was maybe 6 years old, and loved the Beatles and many of the other groups that were current at that time. And I think there was, chiefly because of the Vietnam War, but and the civil rights movement, there was just a lot of ferment in society, and the rock music was reflecting that turmoil in a way that I don't think has ever happened in subsequent years. So it became a way of understanding what was going on in this very confused time.
There's another connection between you and me, because the Beatles were the very first group I ever remember listening to, and even though now I'm a huge fan of jazz, and I spend most of my time listening to and reading about and writing about jazz, the Beatles are still a constant presence in my life, and they really showed me what good pop music was all about before I had a chance to discover jazz.
Right.
Now, you were writing fiction, but at some point you decided to quit writing fiction and concentrate on scholarship. Well, why did that happen?
Well, chiefly because I was encountering no success as a fiction writer. I mean, I was extremely naive, of course, because I wrote these stories, whether it be horror stories or detective stories, and naively sent them off to major magazines like Playboy or Atlantic Monthly, or even like Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, with the hope that I might get accepted. But of course, they were all rejected. And I remember having an enormous stack of rejection slips that I collected for many years. But so I said, and I also began to realize that I didn't feel as if I really had anything to say as a fiction writer. All my fiction was simply imitative of some of the writers that I had enjoyed, and maybe that's natural at an early stage. But I felt I wasn't I wasn't finding my own voice as a fiction writer. So I said, well, let me try criticism. And again, Lovecraft became the focus, because as I read Lovecraft and then read stuff about him, and remember, the Elsbreg de Camp biography came out in 1975, and that was an enormous revelation, because it was the first extensive, connected, biographical study of Lovecraft. He became such a point of fascination with me that I said I had to learn more about him, in part because he reflected some of my own views, whether it be superficially like a love of cats, or more profoundly things like my developing atheism, my love of the past, things like that, which resonated more profoundly with me. And I tried to just soak up everything I could find about Lovecraft, which indeed was not very much at the time. There was not a lot of criticism out there in the general public. It was all devoted in the small press. So I started writing these, works of criticism, and then I got in touch with other scholars or other people interested in Lovecraft at the time. Chiefly was a professor in Georgia named Dirk Mosig, a German immigrant, but he was basically leading the charge for a more academic or more higher level understanding of Lovecraft. And through Mosig, I got in touch with a bunch of other people, who were all trying to do the same thing. And then I sort of fit into that and then started doing work of my own.
You're listening to the voice of St. Joshi, joining us from Seattle, Washington. This is a new episode of The Written Page. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and you'll be able to listen to this episode very soon on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. Of course, Mr. Joshi is one of the leading scholars on the work of Lovecraft, and a very prolific scholar at that, not just regarding Lovecraft, but also many other areas of study. Now, you attended Brown University. Did Lovecraft play a part in your attending Brown University, since he tried to attend Brown and was rejected?
Well, I'll tell you what. I think it might have been the DeCamp biography, which came out when I was 17 years old, that informed me that Lovecraft not only lived in Providence, I mean, I knew that, but also that his papers and manuscripts and all sorts of other material was at the library of Brown University. And so I said, all right, I have to go there, in order to, foster my work on Lovecraft. And that was basically just at the time when I was applying to colleges, And as I say, I had done well in school, so I thought I had a good chance of getting into some of the higher level elite colleges. In fact, my mother allowed me to apply only to Brown, Yale, and Harvard. And I hoped I would get into one of those. If not, I'd be in a pickle. Luckily, I got into both Brown and Yale. I got accepted there. Harvard put me on their waiting list, so I said, "All right, fine, goodbye, Harvard." Didn't want to go there anyway. My mother pleaded with me to go to Yale because she thought it was a more prestigious institution. But I put my foot down and said, "I'm going to Brown." Not only because it's a great institution, it is, but because of all that Lovecraft stuff. I mean, basically. I went there and got a sort of advanced degree in Lovecraft studies, in essence, while also doing other work that was very fulfilling. I actually studied classical literature, Latin and Greek, and ancient history, ancient philosophy, and that was a fascinating thing in itself. But anytime I wasn't in a class or doing homework, I was over at the library there, poring through all these manuscripts, and I tell you, I couldn't have done a fraction of what I've done since without that experience.
How did the study of Latin and Greek mythology and literature give you an insight into the world of Lovecraft, if any?
Oh, it did, because Lovecraft himself was fascinated with these ancient cultures. He was a great devotee of Latin. He never knew Greek very well. You can tell that because he tried to devised the etymology of the word Necronomicon and totally botched it. It's completely wrong, but no matter. He loved ancient Greek society, but particularly Roman society and Roman history, and read well in those languages. But beyond that, the study of Latin and Greek is how can I put this? It allows a very detailed understanding of the language. You have to, in order to understand a work of literature in those languages, you also have to know the culture and the background and the history, because it's so foreign to us. I mean, it was such a long time ago. You cannot simply read a text and understand it. You have to do a lot of background work. And I applied those principles to understanding where Lovecraft was coming from in terms of his culture, his society, his intellectual influences.
Now, not to mention the amount of knowledge that one acquires about grammar and vocabulary from just learning the languages. I was very lucky in that, growing up in Spain and then moving to the United States, I got the chance to actually study both Latin and Greek at when I was in high school, and then I took some more in college, and that has greatly expanded my knowledge of vocabulary, my knowledge of grammar, and I think it's a lot easier to learn a new language once you have that background.
Oh, absolutely, and certainly. I mean, I learned French in high school just because I was interested, and I kept on a little bit. In fact, to the degree that I was able to translate an important scholarly work on Lovecraft from French, the treatise by Maurice Lévy, and I was glad to get that into English. But the study of Latin and Greek really helps bone up your English grammar, and to this day, I apply some of those rules to the writing of English.
Now, you didn't have absolutely any pressure from your mom, really, when she was telling you either one of these three universities, you have to go to one of those three. You were shooting really high at this, right?
Well, I think my mother expected me to aim high, and failure was not an option for her. She herself was an academic. My father was an academic. All my two sisters have gone into the sciences on a very high level. So I'm the lone humanist in my family, in some senses. But I was expected to succeed just as all my other members of my family were.
You did receive a master's from Brown, and then you were accepted into the PhD program at Princeton University. You stayed there for 2 years, and you did not complete the program. Would you like to talk a little bit about why you decided to leave before you completed the PhD?
Yeah, well, at that time, I was in a PhD program that would have lasted 5 years. Apparently, my master's degree at Brown counted for nothing. At Princeton, because it was a whole different system, and it didn't really matter. So I was, after 2 years, I knew I would have at least 3 more years, because it was an interdisciplinary program between the classics department and the philosophy department. I was focusing in classical philosophy. But more generally, I became dissatisfied with the academic world. I felt it was not where I belonged. It seemed a little too insular, too cut off from the real world. And moreover, I was finding increasing difficulty balancing my, interest in classical literature and philosophy and my work on Lovecraft and other writers. I mean, you simply couldn't do both at the same time. There was not enough time in the day, and I said I'm going to have to choose one or the other. And I frankly chose Lovecraft. I mean, because I said, this is really what I want to do. I think I can make more contributions in Lovecraft than in the classical philosophy. There's so many, classical philosophy has been studied for thousands of years. So I don't know what I could do there. But so I left and luckily got a job in publishing in New York City, which allowed me to do a good bit of Lovecraft stuff on the side.
Has your opinion about the academic world changed or evolved over all these years?
Let's just say I'm happy I did not become an academic. It's just I don't like the trend of criticism that people now write. It's not my cup of tea, and I tried not to write in an academic manner. I try to make my work accessible to a broader public than that.
And I would totally understand and agree with that completely. Now, not being a professor, was it difficult for you to enter the scholarly world, to be accepted into that realm?
Well, incredibly enough, my first book, which was H.P. Lovecraft, 4 Decades of Criticism, was accepted by Ohio University Press when I was 20. I was still an undergraduate. This was 1978. The book didn't come out till 1980, but it was accepted in late 1978. And as I was writing to them, they kept referring to me as Professor Joshi, because they couldn't imagine anybody else but a professor doing a work of this kind. It just, at that time, the notion of an independent scholar was quite rare. I mean, very few people were doing this kind of work, so they assumed I was a professor. I may have fostered that illusion by writing to them on sort of, I wouldn't say fake Brown University stationery, but I let them know that, I had an address at Brown University, so I think they must have assumed I was a professor at Brown, although, frankly, they could have easily figured out that I wasn't. But anyway, once I signed the contract with them, I said, you don't have to call me professor anymore. I'm just an undergraduate. And apparently they freaked out a little bit. But then I said, I presume you accepted this book on its merits and not on who I am. So why don't you just calm down and live with it? And in fact, the book did very well for them. It got widely reviewed in both academic and non-academic journals. Sold a good many copies. Went through a couple paperback printings. So I presume they were happy with it. And then once you have that publishing credit, it's easier to get other books published, whether you're an academic or not. And again, by that time, as the 80s and 90s progressed, the notion of being an independent scholar became less unusual, and publishers were more open to that idea, especially because academic publishers wanted books that had a broader appeal rather than just an appeal to academics, because it would sell more copies, and that would do well for them then.
Although not much had been written about Lovecraft by the time you began writing about him in earnest, were there any scholars or writers about Lovecraft that you admired back then?
Well, Dirk Mosig was really my mentor for many years, well, several years. He himself had some difficulties, personal difficulties, and had to leave the field around 1980, and unwittingly I kind of took over from him, even though I was still quite young. But there were other scholars starting to do this kind of work. Donald R. Burleson, who's still around with us, was a professor himself, although he was actually a professor of mathematics, but he was doing a good bit of Lovecraft criticism. A number of others, not a lot of professors, but just interested students, interested people who had a scholarly bent. And I hope that I helped this cause by founding the journal Lovecraft Studies in 1979, while I was still at Brown, and it was published twice a year, and I think it funneled a lot of good criticism to the public.
That's a wonderful journal. How did that project come about?
Well, by that time, I had become acquainted with Mark Michaud, who was a year younger than me, had gotten into Brown, but had already established his small press, Necronomicon Press, as early as like 75, I think, 1975. And so he was publishing some rather crudely produced volumes, but they became better as the technology improved to publish books of that sort. But in sometime in 1979, we were sitting down and said, we need a venue for Lovecraft scholarship. There's just too much out there, and there weren't other magazines that could publish enough of this kind of material. So I said, let's do it ourselves, and why not? And we had actually trouble getting going. That first issue had 3 items by me, and probably more than it should have. But in the course of time, lots of other people contributed really good work, and it went on for more than 20 years, I believe.
Now, you yourself edited or have edited the most authoritative annotated editions of Lovecraft's fiction that are available out there. Tell us a little bit about that project, how that began, how it came about, and what difficulties you encountered. I suppose that you would have encountered certain difficulties as you worked on this, because it's not an easy task.
Well, here's the funny thing. We're talking about my Penguin Classics editions. I had long been interested in getting out some annotated editions of Lovecraft, not necessarily because of the annotations, but because I wanted a publishing company on the level of Penguin Classics to sort of establish Lovecraft as an important writer of general literature, not just of horror fantasy literature. And I felt that imprint would be very prestigious and would help to raise Lovecraft's reputation. The funny thing is, I at that time had no idea that they were even interested in such an idea, because Lovecraft was still not held in high esteem. As late as the mid-1990s, he was still, regarded as somewhat of a pulp writer, not taken seriously. We had done a big centennial conference at Brown University in 1990, and that was a huge success, but I'm not entirely sure how widely covered that was beyond the immediate Lovecraft circle. So I'd seen all these Penguin Classics books, and I loved them. I had many of them myself, all different types of writers, whether it be classical writers or more contemporary writers. And I somehow thought that those works were produced in England at the London office. So I wrote to somebody, I can't remember who, in London, saying, actually, I take it back. I'm now remembering this. I was not actually querying about Lovecraft. I was querying about Ambrose Bierce, because I had just done an edition of Ambrose Bierce with University of Tennessee Press. I'm sure you're familiar with that, the 3-volume edition of Bierce's collected writings. And there was no annotated edition of Bierce in the Penguin Classics, which I thought was incredible and a grave injustice, because Bierce is certainly an established American author. Anyway, so I wrote to somebody at Penguin about Bierce. Well, this letter got forwarded back to the New York office, which is, in fact, where the Penguin Classics editions are generated. And this person, Michael Millman, wrote to me saying, we already just got somebody to do, who was working on an Ambrose Bierce book, which I thought was fine. I mean, I didn't have to be me. But then he says, "Oh, but we've been trying to get in touch with you because we want to do a Lovecraft volume." And I tell you, you could knock me over with a feather. I mean, I was flabbergasted. I said I had no idea that they had this interest. So I said, "I'll be happy to do such a book if you want me to." And he signed me up very quickly. And so the first volume, The Call of Cthulhu and Other Stories, came out in 1999 and has done incredibly well for them. That edition you showed me earlier is in fact a reprint, a sort of a deluxe edition that came out in 2011, 2013, something like that.
That's right, and this was an edition that actually my wife gave me for Valentine's Day one year.
Nice. But that the regular Penguin Classics edition has been through 25, 30 printings. The printings are small, I understand, but nevertheless, that's still quite impressive. And Millman basically said, you can have as much space for annotations as you want. So I said, all right, thank you very much. I'll do that. Now, the first volume was meant to be sort of the best of Lovecraft stories. And it's interesting because I had some disputes with him about what to include. I actually did not want to include the Dunwich Horror. I've never liked that story. I think that has some serious problems in conception. And so, over his objections, I did not include the Dunwich Horror, even though it's a famous story. Everybody wants to read it. I left it out. But he insisted that I include Herbert West Reanimator because, obviously, of the Stuart Gordon films, Reanimator and their successors. And he said it's such a popular story now, we have to have it in the book. And even though Lovecraft felt it was one of his worst works of fiction, I said, all right, we'll do it. So I did that volume. And then I did a second volume. Now that volume, the second one, is that The Thing on the Doorstep? Yeah. That came out in 2001. Now that had his two short novels, or two of his short novels, At the Mountains of Madness and The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. Now, those novels are incredibly rich in detail and required enormous amounts of annotation. And I had to work very hard at that. In particular on At the Mountains of Madness, because I myself don't have a lot of scientific training. And of course, that novel is full of references to biology, paleontology, geology, all things of that sort. And I had to do quite a bit of study to sort of bone up on those subjects, and specifically on what Lovecraft knew about those subjects at the time. And so that was quite difficult. Charles Dexter Ward has other problems in the sense that he, this incredibly detailed history of Providence that he provides requires a lot of looking into in terms of the background there. And so I had to, look at old histories of Providence to see where Lovecraft had gotten this information, and it was fascinating. And so I did that one, and then a third volume came out in 2004.
Well, fortunately, we have them now, and all the fiction is put together in these volumes, and these are the editions that I believe to be the standard editions. I'm sure they're the ones that get used in order to translate Lovecraft into other languages. I will tell you that, of course, I began reading Lovecraft originally in Spanish translation, and only later did I get to read the original stories, of course, through your editions. And I'm really grateful to you, really, although obviously I've never met you, and until today I haven't really gotten a chance to talk to you. These books have been very important to me over the years because I've read them over and over again. But besides Lovecraft, you became, throughout the 1980s, extremely interested in other writers of what is known as the weird tale. Could you explain briefly to the listeners of the written page what is meant by this term, this label, the weird tale?
I wish I knew. I'm not entirely sure it has a concrete meaning. I take the meaning from Lovecraft, who I don't know if he invented the term, but he certainly used it a lot in his letters and essays and popularized it as a term. And I take it, what Lovecraft I think meant, he meant it as a broad umbrella term for the whole range of fantasy horror, not science fiction, but fantasy horror, maybe other types of writing of that sort, because he knew, in his perspective, writers as diverse as Lord Dunsany, who we would call now a fantasy writer, as well as his own work, or Blackwood, or Mackin, all constituted parts of the weird tale. Anything that what he said defied natural law in some manner or other. He didn't care for the non-supernatural horror tale, like Ambrose Bierce, occurrence on Oak Creek Bridge, let's say. Although he liked Bierce and talked about it in supernatural horror literature, but I think he didn't care that much for the non-supernatural. I believe that certain forms of the non-supernatural horror are parts of the weird tale. So I also use it as an umbrella term to cover a broad range of subgenres within this field. And I was particularly taken with Lovecraft's essay Supernatural Horror Literature because I think he was quite correct in identifying what he called the four modern masters of the weird tale. That is, the writers of his own day, namely Arthur Machen, Algernon Blackwood, Lord Dunsany, and M.R. James. And so I devoted myself to studying these four particular writers because it was also obvious to me that they had influenced Lovecraft in various ways, and I wanted to trace that influence. I particularly became interested in Lord Dunsany. In fact, I compiled a bibliography of Dunsany and have done other works on him. Machen and Blackwood I've done a little less on, but I also was lobbying Penguin Classics to issue volumes of these writers. And I succeeded fairly early on with Blackwood. They thought Blackwood was important, and so I got one volume of Blackwood. I had trouble convincing them of Dunsany because Dunsany was actually quite obscure, and they didn't think that he would sell very well. And I think my Penguin Classics editor didn't like Dunsany very much. But finally, I wore him down, and we got a book of Dunsany's best stories out there in 2004, and actually it's done quite well. And I remember Ursula Le Guin writing a very nice review of this in the Los Angeles Times, so I think that was nice. James is a curious thing. I myself didn't feel that I had enough expertise on James to do a Penguin Classics edition. Now, and in fact, I was also not all that enthusiastic about James's writing. I had, of course, read him many years before, and of course I had written a chapter on him in my book, The Weird Tale. But I now realize that chapter was actually not a very good piece of work. It was actually too harsh. I felt that James was somewhat, was not up to the level, aesthetically speaking, of the other writers I covered in that field, whether it be Blackwood or Machen or Lovecraft himself. And yet I now realize that chapter was actually fairly superficial because I had not really done enough research on James to really understand him. But Penguin eventually wore me down and said, please do a volume of M.R. James. And they did it not because they thought highly of James, but because they wanted a volume that would compete against the Oxford World Classics edition of James. I think it's called Casting the Runes, edited by Michael Cox, who is a leading James scholar. Penguin Classics felt they were rivals of the Oxford World Classics series, and they wanted to make sure that they had covered all the writers that Oxford had covered. So they finally wore me down and said, "Okay, I'll do one volume of James. Let's see what that's like." And so then I undertook a thorough examination of James's writing, and I read both of his biographies, one by Michael Cox, the other by Richard Pfaff. I don't know exactly how you pronounce his name, P-F-A-F-F. That biography covered mostly his scholarly work, whereas the Cox biography covered more generally his broader literary work, and particularly his ghost stories. And through those works and other works of scholarship, I found James a lot more interesting than I had before, and I felt that his work had more substance than I had believed before. And so I was happy to edit this first book, and then we did a second book that basically has pretty much the complete ghost stories that he published.
You're listening to a new episode of The Written Page, a podcast you'll be able to listen to on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. And this is a conversation that we're having with St. Joshi, who's joining us from Seattle, Washington. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez. I have those two volumes in my hand that Mr. Joshi was talking about, Count Magnus and Other Ghost Stories, and The Haunted Doll's House, and other ghost stories. I would like to spend just a little bit more time talking a little bit about M.R. James. He's a writer that I particularly like. I discovered him in high school precisely. The teacher of Latin and Greek that I had back then was a huge fan, and still is a huge fan of ghost stories. And so she directed me to this translation of M.R. James into Spanish, also a 2-volume translation that did not have the complete stories, but had quite a few of them. I think it was actually a translation of the first 2 books of ghost stories that M.R. James wrote, the Ghost Stories of an Antiquary and More Ghost Stories of an Antiquary. And I was just fascinated by M.R. James. And these 2 books that I have in my hand on the Penguin Classics, edited by S.T. Joshi, are, I think, the best place to find the complete ghost stories of M.R. James. Now, this is how I first heard of you, via this Penguin editions of the M.R. James ghost stories. How influential were really James's stories? Not just on Lovecraft, who really speaks very highly of M.R. James in his supernatural horror and literature essay, but how influential were there in the weird tale realm in general?
They've been hugely influential, and of course today there's an enormous little cottage industry devoted to James, but he himself had some immediate successors, maybe even contemporaries, people like R.H. Malden and E.G. Swain. I remember A.N.L. Munby wrote a book called The Alabaster Hand that are pretty much pastiches of James's stories. But I think James's influence is broader even than that. To my mind, I think James basically represents a culmination of the orthodox ghost story that had been going on really since the mid-18th century, and especially during the later 19th century. Lots and lots of English writers, particularly, and some Americans as well, had done a lot of ghost stories, whether it be Edith Wharton or Henry James or Rhoda Broughton or so many others. And I think James really sort of encapsulated the best of the orthodox ghost story. But to the extent that he did that, he led later writers to sort of expand upon his conceptions or maybe do something slightly different. To my mind, his work led to what I call the psychological ghost story. People like Oliver Onions and L.P. Hartley and Walter Delamere. I don't know if they were directly influenced by James, but they could have been. But they explored a realm where we don't know whether the ghostly phenomenon is actually occurring or is simply in our minds. I think the classic instance of that is The Beckoning Fair One by Oliver Onions, a magnificent ghost story where, is this ghostly phenomenon actually occurring, or is it just a product of the author's distorted imagination? And I think that led to a very fruitful line of writing that continues up to today. Nowadays, of course, James himself has been embraced by a wide array of people, and of course, there is a ghost story society, and there's a scholarly journal devoted to James, or at least there was, Ghosts and Scholars. I'm not sure it's still going, but Rosemary Pardo is one of the leading authorities on James, and I was glad to work with her on a volume of scholarship on James that we produced in 2007 that was really very informative to me personally, because it opened my eyes to a lot of what was going on in James's fiction that I was not aware of. I still think that there are certain limitations to the type of ghost story that James wrote. I mean, he did it so well that it's hard to do anything more. You have to go in a somewhat different direction. But nevertheless, he did what he did masterfully well.
James was a scholar's scholar, really. He spent his whole life basically in the academic world, and was very interested in medieval texts and medieval manuscripts and old books and relics and antiques and all that sort of thing. And all of that actually comes through very clearly in his writing and in his ghost stories, which he seems to have written as something to do and something to read to friends at King's College around Christmas time. But in what ways are the ghost stories of M.R. James different than the Gothic literature that was produced in England throughout the 18th and 19th centuries?
Well, I think there's a greater sense of malevolence in James's ghost stories. His ghosts aren't merely these sheeted figures who insubstantial entities that don't have any particular effect, and they are, as Lovecraft said, very aggressive in their pursuit of the human characters in those stories, and that creates a certain sense of clutching horror that you really don't find in a lot of the other ghost stories in the past. I actually do find James very interesting, intellectually speaking, not just because he was a learned individual, but because he was himself somewhat of a philosophical and religious conservative. And I remember reading those biographies, especially the Richard Pfaff one, and he did have some struggles at Cambridge and elsewhere with some of the more advanced thinkers of his day, like Bertrand Russell, like Lytton Strachey, and some of these other people who were openly atheistic, who were scorning the religion, and who were wanting to advance into the modern age. And James tended to be kind of looked back. He was a devoted Anglican, I believe, and didn't like some of these contemporary trends. And some of his fiction actually reflects that, and actually has some rather barbed satire against some of these types of individuals. And so I found James interesting on that level intellectually. My sympathies actually are with people like Bertrand Russell, but nevertheless, I find James's attitudes very interesting.
Well, his family was a very religious family. He was probably the only one in his family that did not follow in his father's footsteps of becoming a clergyman, right?
That's right, yeah. I think he wanted to be, or at least his parents wanted him to be, but he went off in a different direction. And it's funny because Algernon Blackwood also came from a very religious evangelical family and broke with them even more radically than James did.
A little bit like Aleister Crowley as well. Well, in any case, one of the things that I find real interesting about M.R. James is the way that he weaves all this knowledge about old texts and old relics and this Nordic mythology. He seemed to be really interested in places like Denmark and Sweden, Scandinavia. And I think that is in many ways unique about his ghost story writing, that he uses that not just as a background, but sometimes also as a starting point for the horror stories or the ghost stories that he wrote.
Oh yeah, I think James had a clear sense of place. And a lot of the places he visited personally, like I think he himself conducted a sort of bicycle tour of Denmark or something like that. I know he had personal acquaintance with Denmark, and that comes out in a number of his earlier stories. And I think also that's what attracted Lovecraft to James, because Lovecraft had a tremendous sense of place. I mean, not only did he set most of his tales in the New England that he loved, but he also appealed to history and liked to create a certain historical depth in his stories, and I think he when he saw that in James, he felt he was had met a kindred spirit in that regard.
James also liked to use as the protagonists of his ghost stories learned individuals, scholars that were, or gentlemen scholars that were a little bit like himself, really.
Oh, absolutely, and Lovecraft did the same thing too, and I think Lovecraft wanted to be one of these types of scholars. Of course, he not having even graduated from high school, he wasn't able to do that. But what I find also amazing about James is how he can achieve his effects through relatively simple language. I mean, he doesn't use that kind of rich, flamboyant, almost over the top language that Lovecraft or Poe or some others do. His language is almost Hemingway-esque it's spare and austere, and yet it's amazing how he lulls the reader into a sort of false sense of security by creating a certain normality at the beginning of his tales, and then springing the horror on you, subtly in the course of the tale.
I think the normality that you're talking about is essential, because when you start reading a story by M.R. James, if you don't know it's a ghost story, you can't tell until several pages in, because it looks more like a story about a scholar who's trying to find information about this or that topic, or who's traveling to this or that part of the world. So it's very normal at the beginning. It doesn't begin in a shocking way, but gradually starts ascending towards, I wouldn't say climax, because I think Lovecraft wouldn't agree with that. There doesn't seem to be a lot of climax in his stories, but little by little, it's James is suggesting the horror, the supernatural element, so to speak.
Yeah, it's a tremendous that sense of pacing, and Lovecraft really admired the story construction that James demonstrated. In fact, his discussion of James in supernatural horror literature basically focuses on one story, Count Magnus, and he indulges in a long sort of discussion of how that story is basically put together. It's a masterwork of what I call literary architecture, and it's a very complex narrative, not told linearly at all, and I think a brilliant piece of work in that regard.
Lots of metafiction in James as well, a little bit like Cervantes in many ways, because he's always trying to give you the explanation of where he found the information and whose papers they were and where they were found, and as somebody who's deeply interested in the world of Cervantes, as I am, James is also attractive in that way.
Yeah, I mean, there's one story, I can't remember which one, begins with a 200-word passage in Latin that James simply invented. I mean, his Latin was very good, and it purports to be some manuscript that this fellow has discovered. It's amazing. In fact, at the end of this Latin passage, he says, the protagonist says, "Oh, well, I suppose I'll have to translate this," because he can't assume that his readers know Latin anymore. People used to, but not anymore.
I suppose whoever's listening to this conversation would know of M.R. James, but if somebody out there is not acquainted with M.R. James, there are 2 volumes, Count Magnus and Other Ghost Stories, The Haunted Doll's House and Other Ghost Stories, edited by S.T. Joshi on the Penguin Classic series, that I definitely would like to recommend to everyone out there. Time now, Mr. Joshi, to talk a little bit more about Lovecraft, because, Lovecraft is definitely the core of your research, not the only thing you've done. You've branched out in many different directions, but it is as a scholar of Lovecraft that you are known the most, at least by me, and I'm sure by a lot of people out there as well. Now, Lovecraft's fiction is much more popular today than it was during his lifetime. At least his image, as an icon, is definitely more prominent now than it was when he was alive. How can we explain that?
I'm not sure I can explain it. I am, on a daily basis, flabbergasted at how popular Lovecraft is, not just among highbrow readers, but among general readers and young people and people on the internet. And it is not obvious why this should happen, because if you read his stories, they are actually not easy. The language he uses is quite difficult at times. I remember, in fact, when I was still a teenager, my third reading of Lovecraft's fiction, I sat with a dictionary right next to me. This is, of course, way before the internet, and literally looked up every single word that I did not know, and I didn't know. There were lots of words I didn't know. And I'll tell you, I mean, I was very impressed with that vocabulary of his, but it doesn't make for easy reading. I think there are a number of different aspects here. I think one of the things that makes Lovecraft readable today is his timelessness. his work is not so intimately set in the era in which he wrote, the 1920s, 1930s, that it becomes hard to understand from that perspective, because that culture really was very different from ours in many ways. But he doesn't really talk about politics or society in the average sense of the term. He has these lone protagonists, venturing out into sometimes into the wilderness or in remote areas and encountering these fantastic creatures from outer space in a way that transcends his own era. And I think Lovecraft doesn't get enough credit for himself being a master of story construction. The prose is one thing. I think his prose is fabulous. Some people don't like it, but that's their prerogative. But I think he was a master of prose, but he was also a master of how to put a story together in the sense that it leads from the beginning to the end, inexorably to a powerful climax. And that is something that any reader can appreciate, whether they know much about Lovecraft or his time or not.
Well, reading your classic biography of Lovecraft, H.P. Lovecraft, A Life, came out several years ago, it seems to be clear that Lovecraft was a loner when he was growing up, and you can see probably where those lone characters that you're talking about came from.
To some degree, yes. He claimed he had a lot of friends in school, but of course his schooling was very irregular. But yeah, I think fundamentally he kept to himself. He lived the life of the mind, and to do that, you basically are a solitary individual. And later on, he also had a lot of friends, and mostly they were correspondents, and that was his way of communicating with people all around the country, and even a few overseas. So he wasn't exactly the life of the party, although he could be when in certain circumstances. But I also think that Lovecraft recognized that horror is more powerful when it attacks a single individual, who is all by himself, and most of his protagonists are male. But that person stands for the human race in many cases. We as readers, see the world through this narrator's perspective, and the horror comes to us through what he is experiencing.
And Lovecraft was also a very precocious child. He discovered chemistry and astronomy very early on. He self-published his own journals about these topics and other topics at a very early age. How is significant, how important were these discoveries for his later fiction production?
Oh, tremendously so. Lovecraft, was a classic case of the polymath, learning both about science, particularly chemistry and astronomy, but also, becoming interested in literature. He started writing when he was about maybe 6 years old, perhaps even earlier. Fiction, poetry, scientific work. He later on learned, Latin. He learned a little bit of Greek, some French, some Spanish. All his friends testify that he basically, he could speak almost on any subject with some intelligence, and his letters established that. And I think a lot of that knowledge, particularly the scientific knowledge, works his way into his work, and moreover, transforms that work in a way that makes it more than just supernatural. In fact, my understanding of Lovecraft as his role in this field is his melding of supernaturalism and science in a way that produces an amalgam that really has been very influential to later writers.
His father died when he was very young. How did this passing of his father impact the young Lovecraft? Is this something that we can trace through his fiction or through his essay writing or his poetry or anything like that?
Well, perhaps, although after that father died when Lovecraft was 8, his grandfather took over and did a good job of helping Lovecraft's mother raise the boy. But then that grandfather died when Lovecraft was about 13 and a half, and after that, really, he had no male adult presence in his life, really speaking. And basically, he was raised by women, basically his mother and his two aunts, and his mother basically, herself suffered a gradual mental deterioration, and then she ended up dying in the same mental hospital that her husband died in 1921. And I think that relationship with the mother was actually very unhealthy for Lovecraft. I mean, she had a strange love-hate relationship with him for reasons that are too involved to go into. But I think Lovecraft was actually, it was almost a relief and a blessing for Lovecraft that she died when she did. Because it allowed Lovecraft to flower and come out of the shell or the shadow of his mother and actually become something of a more normal human being.
He also seemed to be plagued by psychological problems throughout his life, right?
Well, mostly through in his younger years, especially during his this period with his mother. I mean, as a very young boy, he apparently was had all these nervous problems. That's why his schooling was so irregular. He couldn't sit in school very well. Claimed to even have nervous breakdowns. I'm not sure what that means really at this point. But and he when he had to leave his birthplace to move into a smaller house in 1904, he contemplated suicide. I mean, who knows? But I think it was this influence of the mother that really was causing a lot of these things, because she was simultaneously overprotective of him, wouldn't let him, live a normal life, but also, was emotionally remote, and just was a very bad influence, I personally believe. And these, problems that Lovecraft was facing, somehow many of them dissipated when he became an adult after his mother died. And in the last 10 to 15 years of his life, he was a vigorous individual. I mean, I think to some degree his emotions were always stunted, especially where women were concerned. His marriage to Sonia Green was not a success for a variety of reasons, but I think he really couldn't express himself, in a romantic relationship that way, and that might have been the mother's influence. I don't know. But I'm actually impressed at how Lovecraft recovered from this bad influence of the mother in later years. He actually, became a very decent human being, I think, in later life.
We've already mentioned that he was very impressive as a scholar, even though he did not graduate from high school, right? He didn't have a high school diploma. He wasn't able to attend Brown University the way he wanted to, and the way you did. But when one reads your biography of Lovecraft, one realizes that you put a great deal of emphasis on his role as an amateur journalist in the 19-teens and the 1920s. Why is this role as an amateur journalist so important at this point in his life and in his literary career?
Well, this was a mutually beneficial relationship, because, first of all, this world of amateur journalism, which is not really, there's nothing like it today in the strictest sense of the term. I mean, we have our fan world, we have, social media, but it's not really the same thing. Here are a relatively small group of people, mostly in the United States, a few overseas, maybe 200, 250 people, some of whom published their own little magazines. They did it on their own printing presses. They had their own personal printing presses. They ran off the magazines, set their own type. Other people would contribute, fiction, essays, poetry to these magazines. And it allowed Lovecraft to get out into the world, and escape, this confinement that he had. He'd gone into a certain period of reclusiveness after he had dropped out of high school, and it brought him out of his shell a little bit, and allowed his work to get out to a relatively sympathetic audience of a small group of people who weren't professionals, but who could admire his work because it was fairly impressive work. It was of a higher level than most of what they were doing, but the benefits for him were that it expressed his own non-remunerative goal in writing. He never wanted to write for money. He felt that was degrading. He looked back to the 18th century where he thought writing was what he called an elegant amusement. And so he always wanted to promote that kind of work. He didn't ever really want to be a professional writer, because that he felt that professional writers simply wrote to order and didn't express themselves in terms of what they really wanted to write. They just wrote what other people wanted to read, and he never wanted to do that. Mm-hmm. And so that's why he took to this amateur journalism movement so readily, because it was his ideal of not writing for money.
That reminds me of something that, doing a little research recently about the pulp fiction writer Hugh B. Cave, really popular in the 20s and 30s, 40s, who also lived in Rhode Island for a while. There seems to be this connection to Lovecraft because Hugh B. Cave did write letters to Lovecraft. He had short correspondence with Lovecraft, and they had this controversy about the pulps, about whether it was a good idea to write for money or not. Of course, Lovecraft was against this idea of writing for money, and Mr. Cave thought that the only reason why you would write would be to make some money. So there's definitely, one can understand why those two did not get along very well and why they didn't really correspond for too long.
Well, both him and there were any number of others, like E. Hoffman Price and Lovecraft had a long correspondence over this very point, and they were coming at it from very different directions. I mean, Price, in the early days of the Depression, needed to find some way of making money, and he was a gifted writer, and he deliberately targeted the various pulp magazines with exactly the type of material that they wanted, to survive. And Lovecraft said, "That's fine. You're basically a businessman. You're not really a writer in the aesthetic sense of the term. You're a businessman, and it's a perfectly honorable discipline, perfectly honorable business, but it's not writing.
It's not art, I guess.
It's not art. To be a sincere writer, you write whatever you want to write, not what somebody else wants you to write. And if nobody wants to publish it, well, that's too bad. It still serves its function as being what Lovecraft called self-expression. That's what he felt all art should be."
You were mentioning also of the amateur publications that he dabbled in for several years. Reminds me that not long ago I was reading about Ira Gershwin, the great lyricist and the brother of George Gershwin, one of my favorite lyricists, in fact, and he talked about how important these publications were for lyric writers because of the tremendous opportunity that they had to develop a passion and to hone their skills for what was called at that point light verse, which was really what a lot of the lyrics of popular songs were based on. So I can, when I was reading that part of your biography of Lovecraft, where you're talking about his writing for these publications, that there was kind of an important connection there for me. Mm. Now, one more thing that I wanted to really mention that I think is very important, and we've already started talking about this a little bit, is the pulp magazines in which a lot of the short stories that Lovecraft wrote were published out. The question wouldn't be how important were the pulp magazines in the dissemination of the work of Lovecraft, but because we know that they were extremely important. But how was the work of Lovecraft different from that of the average pulp writers of the time?
Well, Lovecraft's writing evolved amazingly quickly over the course of a very short career. I mean, his career was less than 2 decades long, if we consider his first story really was, the first serious story was Dagon in 1917, and then he died in 1937, so really 20 years, not even 20 years. He began by writing relatively conventional tales of horror, the supernatural, the macabre, but, beginning with The Call of Cthulhu, his stories were exponentially greater in conception and overall power than anything you were reading in the pulp magazines. And that shows because a lot of these stories were rejected by the pulp magazines, particularly Weird Tales, and that had a tremendously negative influence on Lovecraft. Lovecraft was very sensitive to rejection. And I mean, we can say that he was being somewhat irrational in that regard because, I mean, he was writing stuff that was so far above the pulp level that he should have expected it to be rejected, but it affected him badly because he just felt it was some sort of derogation of himself, and he almost never submitted a story somewhere else after it had been rejected once, which again is simply not the attitude of a professional writer. But he wasn't a professional; he never was, even when he was publishing in Weird Tales. And in fact, in later years, he had other people submit stories to these magazines, sometimes not even with his knowledge or permission. That is how both At the Mountains of Madness and The Shadow Out of Time ended up in Astounding Stories after At the Mountains of Madness had been rejected by Weird Tales some years earlier. And I'll tell you, that was a lifeline for Lovecraft in 1936, because he said, I've never been closer to the breadline than I was at that time. He was simply running out of money, and the $600-700 he got basically supported him for a whole year. You could live, frugally on that kind of money for a year. But no, he it is because his stories became so much grander, so much more complex than what was expected in pulp, that he had real trouble in later years in getting accepted. And of course, the book publishing world really wasn't all that open to him. He had some negotiations with book publishers that never really went anywhere. If he had lived a few decades later, when the paperback revolution happened, he might have gotten into paperback, and as he did indeed later on, after his death. But economically, it was a very difficult time for Lovecraft when he was writing.
In fact, only one book of his short stories was really published during his lifetime.
Well, and that was a pretty sad piece of work in itself. It was a small press production of The Shadow over Innsmouth, and that was full of errors, typographical errors, and in fact, the whole edition wasn't even bound. I think the publisher printed about 400 copies, only bound about 200 of them, sold a few of those for $1 each, and basically garnered no attention whatsoever. And yet, ironically enough, there's one. I've seen one copy of that book lately. I think it was signed by both Lovecraft and maybe Clark Ashton Smith. That was going for like $17,000. It's absurd, what you can get for some of these things on the used book market. And of course, Lovecraft would not profit from that a dime. But yeah, that was he didn't know how to market himself, because again, he felt that was not the gentlemanly thing to do. I mean, he was not. He didn't want to be a huckster, a promoter of his own work. And that was to his economic disadvantage, but at least it preserved his aesthetic integrity.
When you say that his stories became increasingly more complex, more difficult, of course, he was creating a whole mythology, a whole universe of his own that actually, has survived, and other people are writing stories in the same vein, or have written up until the present stories that are use that sort of mythological landscape and mythological realm as the basis for these stories. But in what way were the later stories different or more complicated than the earlier ones?
Well, Lovecraft testified that he simply couldn't write short stories anymore. Almost all his later works from the last 10 years of his life are either novelettes or novellas, because there's so many layers and so many levels in them. He felt that in order to really work out the ideas in question required greater scope. They were not full-length novels, but they were way beyond short stories. So that, to this day, that's a very difficult form to get published, because it's just hard to find a venue for those kinds of works. And the ironic thing is that during the 1930s, other people, like other of his colleagues, like Robert Bloch or August Derleth or Frank Belknap Long, actually were writing stories set in using the Cthulhu mythos as a basis, but they were writing more orthodox stories that actually did get published in the pulp magazines. In fact, I think probably more stories of the mythos by these other writers appeared than by Lovecraft himself in his own lifetime.
You're listening to the voices of St. Joshi, joining us from Seattle, Washington. This is a new episode of the Written Page. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, talking to you from Jackson in the state of Tennessee. And as we're winding down our very interesting conversation with Mr. Joshi, there's just a couple more things I'd like to touch upon. One of them is your biography of Lovecraft, H.P. Lovecraft, A Life, which came out originally in 1996, if my notes are not mistaken. And it definitely is a standard work of its kind. If anyone wants to read about Lovecraft in a serious manner, get deeper into his life and his career and his literary production, that is definitely the word to check out. Could you tell us a little bit about how you came to write this book?
Well, I'll tell you. Through my early years, early decades of interest in Lovecraft, I felt that I was solely interested in the work, the literary work, whether it be the stories or the essays, poetry, letters, what have you. The life, I mean, I was interested in the life only to the extent that it, had some influence on the work. But I also recognized over the course of time that the camp biography, which I loved at the age of 17, had some drawbacks, had some deficiencies, both in terms of factual errors, but also a lot more information had come out about Lovecraft. And I felt that also that the camp had not done enough of a job of putting Lovecraft in the context of his times historically and culturally, and I felt something more was needed in that regard. And I was actually hoping that anybody else, would write a biography, because I knew that it would be an enormous task to do so, and I just didn't know if I could even spare the time or had the real interest in doing so. But by the early 1990s, I became convinced that nobody was going to do it, so I said I better do it myself before I become too old. And so I sat down and spent 2 full years writing this biography, and I thought, oh, well, maybe it'll come to perhaps 200,000 words, 250,000 words, which is a pretty big book in itself. Well, as I kept writing and I kept coming upon all this information, especially in the last 10 years of his life, there's so much documentation that the book finally came out to over 500,000 words. And again, in a sense, I wrote it for self-expression. I wasn't even thinking of a market, of a publisher. I said, I have to get this out there. I have to get all this information down. Whether it ever gets out to anybody, I don't know. It doesn't matter. But so there it was, and I actually did, and try to get this book published by some mainstream publishers, but they just weren't interested. Maybe it was just too big for them. So finally, Necronomicon Press came to my rescue and said, let's get this work out. It's too important to lie there unpublished. But even he couldn't publish it in its full length. So I said, can you cut it down a little bit? Maybe a mere 350,000 words. So I said, all right, I'll try to do that. And that was easy enough to do, because I wouldn't say there's dead weight. It's all interesting, I like to think, but obviously some things are more important than others to get across. So I got it down to 350,000 words, and it came out, and I'll tell you, it obviously did very well. I was particularly flattered when Joyce Carol Oates wrote a sort of review essay on it for the New York Review of Books, and basically I think she was looking for a way of expressing her own interest in Lovecraft, and she used this biography to do that, which is fine. But I will mention that eventually I said, I really want that full version to be published someday, and so I convinced Hippocampus Press to do the full version a couple of years ago as I Am Providence, The Life and Times of H.P. Lovecraft, in 2 volumes, and that does have the full version updated as well as, with new findings that have come to light in the last 10, 15 years. And now still newer findings have come to light. I mean, small points perhaps, but things that I would like to get in, but I'm not entirely sure there's going to be another edition anytime soon.
When we have a writer that wrote so many letters throughout his life, and his life is so well documented, the difficulty is what to leave out, right?
Indeed. And I'll tell you, I'm sure you know that I am now actually helping to publish these letters and in their entirety, and it's going to be 20, 25 volumes, and we've done quite a few already, and more to come. And I tell you, each volume, I think, is a revelation in some way or other, and just sheds more light on Lovecraft.
He definitely was one of the most prolific letter writers of all time, really, if you think about it. But in your opinion, Mr. Joshi, what were Lovecraft's major contributions to supernatural fiction in particular and literature in general in those 20 years that he wrote?
Well, as I say, he gradually discovered, I think, that many of the standard motifs in supernatural fiction, the ghost, the vampire, the werewolf, haunted house, were done to death. I mean, they were not aesthetically viable anymore because science had advanced to the point where we can't believe in these entities even in a work of fiction. And so Lovecraft felt that something new had to be done. Where could he find new motifs to incorporate into work that is still, horrific, or weird? Well, there's the depths of space. Because that's still relatively unknown. We haven't gone out there much. We don't know what's out there. And so that's why he started creating this mythos of entities that are really they're not gods, even though some human beings worship them as gods, but they are really just space aliens who have come to the Earth and had these fleeting encounters with human beings. But they also reflect his sense of the cosmic, this sense of human insignificance within the vast realms of space and time. And that conception, I think, is expressed by Lovecraft better than almost anybody else in all literature, and that really, I think, is his defining characteristic. I also think that Lovecraft is very important in how much assistance he lent to other writers, and I think that's what has caused him to become such a legendary figure in this field, because he helped so many other writers, help in terms of, reading their work, making substantive criticism, whether it be like Robert Bloch or Derleth or Donald Wandrei or Clark Ashton Smith or C.L. Moore, Henry Kuttner. I mean, the list goes on and on. And as a result, all these people, had such a devotion to Lovecraft that they got together, particularly Derleth and Wandrei, after his death, to rescue his work from the pulp magazines and then to carry on the legacy well after his death. And that legacy continues on today with people who never even knew Lovecraft. But I think the fact that he was such a mentor to these younger writers was immensely important in the development of the field.
There may be somebody out there who has no idea who Lovecraft is, and if that is the case, what work or works would you recommend that these people read first?
Well, that's hard to say. I personally think that my favorite work is At the Mountains of Madness, but that is a difficult work to get into. It's very dense, a lot of scientific knowledge required, and wouldn't want to start with that because it may discourage people. I think The Call of Cthulhu is a masterwork and it's a relatively short work, about 30 pages. In fact, I included that work as Lovecraft's representative work in the anthology American Supernatural Tales, which came out from Penguin in 2007. And I think that really is a signature Lovecraft work, both in terms of its prose and in terms of these cosmic ideas that became his defining characteristic.
And that one is included in the book I have in my hand right now, The Call of Cthulhu, and Other Weird Stories by H.P. Lovecraft, an edition from Penguin Classics, edited by S.T. Joshi. And for those people who know and like Lovecraft, what other writers would you recommend that you have been working on, doing editions of their work, and which might be akin to Lovecraft for people who are already interested in Lovecraft and may not know these writers?
Well, you have to read Arthur Machen, you have to read Lord Dunsany and Alasdair Blackwood, those three in particular. Lovecraft really felt they were the pinnacles of weird fiction. Their work is uneven, to be sure, and they wrote a lot, so you have to be sort of selective in what you read, but the best of their work really is, to my mind, equal or even superior to Lovecraft's. I think Dunsany was a master of English prose, and whether you like the subject matter or not, he wrote fantasy more than horror, but I think his prose is just incredible. And I'll tell you, a contemporary writer, one of several who I could mention, is Ramsey Campbell. To my mind, there is no question that Ramsey Campbell is the preeminent writer of weird fiction in our time. And in fact, he has just completed writing a Lovecraftian trilogy of novels. I can't remember what the overall name of that trilogy is, but you can find out for yourself. And it is a magnificent piece of work. The Lovecraft influence is somewhat indirect, but Campbell does reflect that cosmic perspective that Lovecraft had, and I think Lovecraft himself would have found this work to be very inspiring, and it is a great contribution to weird fiction, and Campbell has done many other works that are very important.
And finally, you have written so many books and done so many editions and books on different topics. One wonders how you find the time to do that. But that is not the question. You've written books that deal with politics. You've written books that deal with prejudice, racial prejudice, gender prejudice in America. What are the projects that you're working on right now besides editing the letters, the complete letters of H.P. Lovecraft?
Well, one of the writers I've relatively recently become interested in is Clark Asher Smith, of course, a great colleague of Lovecraft's. And now Smith, in all honesty, I don't care for his fiction that much. I mean, I admire some of it, but I thought he was a great poet. And I was very glad to have edited his complete poetry in 3 volumes some years ago. But I've now just completed, with some other people, a complete bibliography of Smith's writing. So that'll come out later this year from Hippocampus Press. But otherwise, I continue to write. I have compiled my own original anthologies, whether it be of Lovecraftian fiction or other types of weird fiction. And I'm working on an anthology right now called His Own Most Fantastic Creation, which will be stories about Lovecraft as a fictional character. Or a character who sort of maybe resembles Lovecraft or something like that. Because Lovecraft himself, as you mentioned, has become himself an icon in popular culture. And some in some facets that icon is sort of has some myths associated with it, but no matter. So I hope these stories will put Lovecraft himself on the stage, whether it be in a weird fiction context or a more general context. And I've already received some outstanding contributions, so that book should come out next year.
And listeners to this episode of The Written Page might be interested in finding out more about yourself, and I believe you have a website and also a Facebook group. Could you tell us about that?
Well, I do have a website, stjoshi.org. Used to be .com, but somebody... that site is defunct, but .org is the one that has my current information. Now, I have to confess, I am not fond of social media. It's not my thing, really. Maybe it's just a generational thing. But whatever it is, I personally, for me, it's a matter of time. I just don't have the time to engage in this kind of stuff. But somebody else or a couple of other people set up a Facebook page for my fans, assuming I have any. I think it's called the St. Joshi Enthusiasts, and so it's out there on Facebook. Every now and then my wife tells me about certain things that people have said and said, "Oh, do you want to respond to this?" And occasionally I do, but there are about 1,000 people on there, I think, and so it's there. And if you want to follow my work, you can do it that way or through my website.
But on stjoshi.org, you do write a blog as well occasionally.
I do, not terribly often, maybe twice a month. It's just a matter of time. I'm doing so much, it's hard to write about what I'm doing when I'm actually doing it. So, but I do like to keep people informed of forthcoming projects.
St. Joshi, it has definitely been a pleasure to talk to you on this episode of The Written Page. Now, after so many years of following your editions and collecting several of them and having several of them on my shelf, it is an even greater pleasure to know that you're a wonderful person, wonderful to talk to, and I appreciate your having been our guest today on The Written Page. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
And this has been a new episode of The Written Page. Our guest has been St. Joshi, joining us from Seattle, Washington. And this episode of The Written Page will be available on my YouTube channel, Anton GF, very soon. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, talking to you from Jackson, Tennessee. This has been a new episode of The Written Page. The copyright is mine, Anton Garcia Fernandez, the year 2018, and this episode has been recorded live in Jackson, in the state of Tennessee, in the United States of America. Thank you so much for your attention, and thanks to St. Joshi for answering our call here on The Written Page.